Okay, there we go.
Welcome, everyone. This is What's Your Career Path? And my name is Jenny Poo. I am the co-chair of the Buckles LAMP Committee, here with my wonderful co-host and partner in crime on my screen
Hey,
up there.
hey guys, I'm Tara Cooper. I'm the director of the Johnson Public Library in Hackensack, and we're so excited to have you all here today on our wonderful panel. I'm just going to keep admitting folks, and please mute yourself when you come into the room just so we can avoid extra background noise. Thank you.
And how today it's going to work, we have a wonderful panel of 5 really leaders in our field. We have great representation from Buckles, and we have a very special guest dialing in from the West Coast bright and early. What I will do is I will ask our panel to introduce themselves, and we can get started with questions. We'll have time at the end for your questions and answers. That said, if there's a burning question that you can't wait till the end, or you want to make sure that gets asked, please drop it into the chat. Tara will be monitoring the chat. This is also being recorded so that we can share out afterwards. So without further ado, I will go and get started with the first question, which is just intros. So I'm going to call your name. You can just say please share your name, your title, which library you're at. So we'll start with Genesis.
Hi, my name is Genesis Duart. I am the head of technology at the Johnson Public Library in Hackensack.
Oops, I went the wrong order. Perinda.
Good afternoon. My name is Perinda Desai. I'm the library director at the Demarest Library in Bergen County.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Joan from the West Coast.
Good morning, good afternoon. Joan Hodgson Singh, Director of Library at the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art.
Calling in from California, bright and early. Thank you, Joan. And Nicole.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nicole Marconi. I'm the collections manager here at the Hoboken Public Library.
And Emily.
Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Weisenstein. I'm the head of patron services at the Livingston Library.
Great. Thank you so much. So we'll go ahead and get started with our first question. Let's go and get started with Perinda, since I didn't have the right order. Perinda, and this is a question for all of our panelists. What do you do in your current role in your library?
So as you all know, I'm the library director. This is my 4th year as the director of the Demarest Library. And I do everything from when I started working here almost 4 years ago. I did programming, collection development, I have a new staff, which I was able to recruit and have them on board in these last 4 years. But as and when I progressed into my role, I now have a part-time bookkeeper. I have a dedicated staff who does programming. So now my role has shifted from more to outreach, working with the bureaucrats in town, working with the Borough Hall, and working with the various committees in Buckles.
Thank you, Perinda. Emily, can you talk about what you do in your current role at the library?
Sure. I'm the head of patron services. I manage a staff of 15 full-time and part-time library assistants and library specialists. And we are basically running the circulation, the delivery, we're dealing with shelving, we're handling all the library accounts and cards, and we're just all around the basic customer service department. We're handling, the lion's share of the patron problems, issues, service that comes up. I also manage all of the e-content collection development here at the library. So that's it.
Great, that's it. Emily, Genesis.
I oversee all of the tech at the library, so that includes our Wi-Fi, computers, phones, as well as helping the patrons with their tech and staff. And this is a new department for 2.5, almost 3 years. So really just carving out the space for this as a formal department in our very large library. It's been quite a busy task.
Great, thank you. Nicole.
Hi, so I'm the collections manager here. I just handle all the collection development. This is also a new department for about 1.5 years. So I handle everything involving ordering. That includes adult, youth services, YA, I also handle our vinyl collection and our Library of Things collection. And I also do programming as well. So I run a cooking program and I also run a knitting club.
And I will say, Nicole's cooking program is fantastic. And Joan, why don't you tell us what you do as the founding library director of the Lucas Museum of Narrative Experience?
Art.
Art.
Narrative art. Yeah.
Thank
So,
you.
so I'm the inaugural library director because our museum is opening sometime next year. And I say that because if you go to the website, you could see renderings of our building, which is situated in South LA, very central to sort of our version of Museum Mile over there. And so I was brought in about, I think I reached my 1 year mark already. So that's been really cool. And so, it's sort of different than what we all come into library directorship with, inheriting things and processes. And so I get to have this wonderful opportunity in which I'm, working sort of in a startup environment. And so the kind of work I'm doing right now is thinking about programming policies, staffing, budgets, really educating my colleagues and working with them to talk about what a library budget would look like, so, and then I get this really wonderful opportunity to sort of revolutionize the idea of what a museum library can be and has been, and sort of doing it in a way where I kind of, what's the word, sort of forge my own path until I'm told no, which I would say a lot of the different positions I've held in my career, in my whole trajectory, has really put me in this right spot at the right time. So a little bit of everything, what everyone's mentioned: collection development. I was prior head tech services. Right before Lucas, I was the dean, institute librarian at CalArts, which was the job that brought me from New York to California. So thanks for having me.
No, thank you so much. And it's a perfect segue to our next question, which is, we're going to go back in time for all of us. Let's talk about either your first or one of your earliest jobs in library in this field. And if you can also just mention whether this is your first or second career, can you talk about your first jobs and how that influenced your career trajectory? And this time we'll start with Nicole.
So Jenny already knows, but I have a lot of things to say because I'm a career changer. This is my second career. So I used to be a stage manager. So when I was thinking about what to change careers to, I thought to myself, like, I just want to be around books all day. And that was the only criteria. So then I figured, maybe I will look into library school and see what that looks like. So one of my first library jobs was actually working at NYPL's, the Library for the Performing Arts, as a library page. And that actually was a great use of my skills because I was bringing my skills from the theater world into the library world and sort of mixing them. And it was also a great job to see if I actually wanted to work in libraries, or if I wanted to work in archives or something like that. So that was a great first job, getting exposed to that.
And I did not know that. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Genesis.
So I started here at the Johnson Public Library as a page years and years and years ago when I was a freshman in high school. And back then I was very idealistic about the world going into college and thinking I wanted to work in nonprofits. And then being exposed to libraries and them bringing me on more, I became an assistant. I've done just about every single department in libraries. It kind of made me realize that what I wanted to do was help people, help my community. And so I was just like, well, I landed in the right place and I'm just gonna stay here. So I've worked in other libraries as well, like Rochelle Park, when they were brought back into Buckles, and that was a whole learning experience in and of itself because I was able to do collections and programming and managing team volunteers. I worked in Leonia and Glenrock, so that gave me exposure to different kinds of communities as well. So I've just been all over the place.
I love it. Thanks, Genesis. Emily, why don't you share about your earliest library experiences?
All right. So again, this is my second career. My first career was I was a graphic designer for a few years, and I decided after a couple years of essentially sitting behind a computer screen for 8 hours a day, that I hated it. I didn't like sitting all day staring at a screen. And so I went back to school, and I was actually studying to get my school media certification. So I was gonna, try my hand at being a school media specialist. However, I got my first part-time job at the Warren Township branch of the Somerset County Library System as a youth services librarian. And I just found that I really loved working in public libraries. I loved the variety of it. I loved the flexibility. I loved being able to work with all ages. I loved the different types of people that come in, and I just feel like you have a lot of creativity here that I just really enjoyed it. So I stuck with it. And here I am.
And you probably still get to use some of your graphic design skills, I would imagine. Right, Emily?
Yes. I do. Absolutely.
A lot of skills are transferable. Let's hop over Joan.
So I love talking about this just because it's a really unconventional path. But I had my bachelor's in art and art history. Thought I'd be a painter, and then I was like, oh, maybe I'll go for my PhD in medieval art and architecture, because that was my major in my bachelor's. And I was like, I don't want to go to school for a PhD. I don't have money. I'm still paying for my bachelor's. And so I went similarly to Emily. I did sort of graphic design, art production for a manufacturing company for swag. So all this stuff that we get at the library conferences, I was part of the art department that put the logos on that. And then I applied to my first library assistant job was Watson Library at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is where I met Jenny. And, transitioning to that was kind of not fun because it was less money. And so I did the whole, like, I'm going to have 3 library jobs, including this. So I ended up working at the Yonkers Public Library as a library, paging assistant, reference, everything, and the Dobbs Ferry Public Library. And I thought, I always tell, students and upcoming folks that, like, it's a good thing to do different libraries that way so that you kind of know what you don't want to do. But I was fortunate enough to do work with graphic novels in the young adult section at the public library. So that's really what cemented sort of this, like, where I am now. It's like a return to the fold in terms of going back to the art world and getting to do and work with, like, comics and illustrations. So.
Thanks, Joan. And your experience reminds me a little bit of what Genesis was talking about, working at different libraries. So Perinda, why don't you tell us about your journey?
So my journey is a little different from most of the panelists here. I grew up in India, and I was a high school teacher for 6 years before I moved to this country. I was a substitute teacher. I was on a long-term assignment, but I was not happy. It was very different experience being a teacher in India versus being a teacher in this country. So I did my MLS, and I started working as a part-time reference librarian in one of the libraries in Morris County. And then I went back to, I graduated library school when it was very, very difficult to get a full-time job. So since I was a substitute teacher in a school for a long time, the principal offered me a media specialist opening that was there because the media specialist retired. So I tried my hand for a year as a media specialist, but I always had the calling for the public library. And then I took a little bit of a break. I delivered twins, so I had a break. And then I went back again to public libraries, worked part-time, was not even looking for a full-time job, and was fortunate to get an information services librarian job, again in Morris County, and then worked there for 4 years, and then moved up to be a director at the present library. So I was all over the place, worked in schools, worked in libraries, and now I'm a library director.
Which I'm just in awe of. I mean, I can't imagine immigrating to a new country and learning a new language, then rising to library director. So hands up. Also, you have 3 children, so you're a super mom to me. That was my own personal editorial. So, I think some of you already answered some of this next question, which is the variety of roles and specializations within our field. So if you can, if you haven't already, well, let me see, like the different roles, if you had very different roles within this career that you haven't already mentioned, and I don't know who to call on. I'd like to hear about a little bit about that. I mean, certainly Nicole's experience as a stage manager going right into libraries. And I'm going to call Nicole first because I know her. Nicole, because you didn't go right to collections, right? You worked as a youth services librarian.
Yeah, so when I was thinking of library school, like I said, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but I was like super intent on doing stuff with performing arts. And then when I was actually working, while I was going to school, I worked here at the library as a part-time assistant in the children's department. And then when I became a librarian, one of the first jobs I got out of library school was being a children's librarian. And when I was in library school, I was so like, I'm not interested in being a children's librarian. And ironically, the first job I got was that. So yeah, I was at Newark for a little bit and I worked there and I was the head of youth services, and then I came over and was access services manager. So I think my career trajectory was a little bit like all over the place in some ways, but it was great because it got me, all these skills that I wouldn't have necessarily gotten otherwise if I had been like, no, I'm not doing that, or like close myself off, career wise, just like doing one thing. So I think that for me, it was kind of like a blessing in disguise to get all these different opportunities to sort of make myself more well-rounded in that way.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. And Joan, I'm going to jump to you now because you also had a time where you were in academic libraries.
Yeah. So I think, just going back to the first job as a library assistant at Watson Library at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, I recall that it was one of the first positions that they made in which it really belonged to 4 departments. And I always cite this as like why I was able to get to where I am now, was that I belonged to technical services. So I started off in cataloging and systems, but I also belonged, and I say belonged because really they gave me the job that no one, like the stuff people didn't really want to do. So they gave it to the library assistant. And it was the first time they had this like 4 department thing. So I also belonged to interlibrary loan, serials and periodicals, and then acquisitions. So the first year, I mean, I was ordering, helping with like, doing the binding for all our periodicals. And I feel like all that really shaped how I look at even shaping the jobs that I hire for, which is like, this really, we already do it, this like multiplicity of tasks that all librarians do. And I think that's why it's one of the industries, like during COVID, we were really able to pivot so easily, was because we're trained that way. We're sort of trained to triage in these things. What was the question? I'm like sorry, I'm also still just waking up. But yeah, what was we were talking about?
Oh, I was talking about academic.
Academic libraries, and then
you were at that little place called Columbia University.
Yeah, but that was and this is probably going to be answered in some of the other questions, but like my wanting to go to an academic library was mainly salary and opportunity. And so I ended up seeing like, where my skill sets fit, and I was more and more liking acquisitions and doing ordering and ironically budgets, which like, I was an art person, so I still don't like math, but it was one of those things that like made sense. And having the technical services background with cataloging, like handling money kind of made sense, and spreadsheets kind of made sense. So I ended up looking for positions in acquisitions, and I ended up going to Columbia. But that was also because I did not like the maternity leave policies at the museums at the time. And Columbia was very generous with their maternity leave policy. I mean, so this is that like sort of work-life balance that makes us make these decisions when we jump to different careers. So I totally hear the whole motherhood stuff that we're all dealing with when it happens during our career.
Yeah, certainly it was one of the reasons why I left the Met too.
Yeah, there was this exodus of like pregnant women and librarians at the Met. And so it's like Jenny left, and then our colleague Lisa left, and I was like, I'm pregnant too. I don't know how much longer I have here because I don't want to breastfeed in a carrel, one of the graduate carrels. We didn't have lactation rooms. So I love talking about, the real stuff that happens and makes us like, jump ship.
Right, and make these decisions.
Yeah.
Switching over to Genesis, I mean, I just love what is the term that you used? The multiplicity of tasks and careers that you've had within the profession. Anything else you want to add to this question that you didn't talk about in your first question, Genesis?
I guess just the ability or the chances, the opportunities that I've gotten to work in such a variety of tasks in libraries, and then such a variety of populations in libraries, from Leonia to Glen Rock to Rochelle Park to Hackensack, I think has been very useful for me to like narrow down what actually enjoy the most in librarianship. And like just take it on any opportunity that comes your way, because you never know what it could lead to.
That is true. Even if you didn't want to be a children's librarian, like Nicole, those skills came in handy.
Yeah.
Emily, I'm just want to say I'm really glad you're not behind a computer 8 hours a day in your previous profession. Now you're working in the public. What would you like to add to this question?
So I was a children's librarian for years, about a decade. It was my first job. My first 3 jobs were children's librarians. But my first full-time job in libraries was in a very, very small library. It was the Booton Holmes Library in Morris County, and it was 1 floor in an old mansion that had been converted to a library. And so the building was 150 years old. And, you know, when you're working in a very small library like that, you kind of do everything. And so it's one of the big differences because, you know, I went from there to the Madison Library, which was a very mid-sized library in Madison, New Jersey. And then Livingston's a giant library. And so the difference between working in all 3 different sizes of libraries is really has given me a lot of perspective, honestly.
That's a really good point. Yeah, the size of the library and the population that you serve, yeah, can really change your outlook and your career trajectory. Absolutely.
Yep.
Thanks, Emily. Perinda?
So, I was a media specialist, and before that, I was a high school teacher. So when I was in my library school, I was, torn towards working in an academic library. So I even did my internship at the Montclair State University, and I was like, yeah, I think this is where I want to be. And then I was fortunate to get 6 months more of paid internship, and I just wanted to see how I felt about it. But meanwhile, I live in Parsippany, so I used to work as a volunteer at the library, and I helped build the library website, some of the content, and helping sometimes I would work at the front desk, helping the patrons, and I saw that working in an academic library, I was always going to be behind a desk. Sometimes I would get option of, if there are new students, I would just walk them around and show them the library. But other than that, that's it. And that's how I decided that I think I'm a better fit to be in a public library versus an academic library. And then I started part-time job. And then finally, I moved into being an information services librarian at the Denver Library, which actually helped me grow in my position. That's why I'm a director today, is like starting with an information services librarian, then moving up to be a programming librarian, serving on many committees. And at the end of four years, I felt that I'm ready to move forward in my career. And that's how I started looking for a director job.
Yeah, thank you so much. You touched upon a point that we hadn't addressed, which was the benefit of getting involved professionally, whether it's committees, right? Local, especially with local committees. And I want to do a plug, this is committee work, and there's an opportunity for everyone in our consortium to get involved on a committee. So, and that can help with your career trajectory. I'm going to jump to, this is one of my favorite questions, challenges. And I think Joan started to talk about that with the personal and the motherhood challenge, but certainly that is not just the one challenge I'm sure all of you have faced in your career. So can you talk about one?
Having this meeting that they made, career path.
Oops.
1 to 12.
Faith, can you mute yourself? Thank you. Can you talk about, I happen to know that person, an unexpected challenge that you faced in your career in this profession and how you dealt with it or are dealing with it? So for that, I will start with Emily.
So I've got 2 things to add for this. I feel like COVID is the obvious unexpected challenge that happened. All of a sudden, and everyone here is going to have a really different experience with that. All of a sudden, we were all working from home, and I had to come up with projects for 15 library assistants to work on remotely. So we did a lot of webinars and check-ins. And then once we had reopening plans, we were working on all this new training for contactless services and what the library was going to look like in coming back, online from all of that. And so that was obviously a challenge that we're very much back to normal now, thank goodness. But there's still things that we're working through on that end. I guess for a more personal, unexpected challenge, one of the things that after a decade of working with children in children's services, I burned out at my last job, and I needed to come to grips with the fact that I didn't have it in me to keep doing this, to keep doing story times in my 50s and 60s, and accept that there are wonderful children's librarians out there that can do it and do it for decades, and it's great, and I applaud them. They're amazing. But that it wasn't for me, and that I needed to come to grips with that was okay. It didn't mean I failed, but that I needed to find something else at that point. So when the opportunity to work at Livingston came up, I jumped at it, not only because Livingston was a great library, I'm working with a great team, and I'm very happy here, but I needed to recognize for myself that the time had come for me to move on from what I was doing. So I guess for everyone out there, keep that in mind. It's okay to decide, you know what, this current trajectory that I'm on isn't working for me anymore. And it's okay to change and try something else. It doesn't mean you failed. It just means that it's time to move on.
Yeah. Joan, you haven't faced any challenges other than,
So many challenges. But I'm like so thankful, because it's like I'm in this, like I read so many self-help books now. But
you
I'm
also work at the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art, Star Wars. Hello. She sends photos.
And I
I'm
think
at the
that a lot of it,
Skywalker Ranch.
a lot of it has, brought growth because of these challenges. And it all started really because with the first library assistant job, again, like I mentioned, there was sort of this glass ceiling. I wasn't seeing representation. So diversity was a big thing for me, because it was like, oh, I picked this field because I love reading and books, but then it was a very white, and continues to be a very white centric industry. And I remember just wanting to, learn a lot of different things about my job, but I hit that glass ceiling in terms of gender and diversity and representation. Then I got pregnant, and that was a whole nother thing, where I wanted to find a career that would support, the fact that I was working and wanting to take the maternity leave. So it's always been that like work-life balance. But when I went into academic libraries, then there was the issue of tenure track. And at the CUNYs, when my last job was at CUNY Lehman College, I was on tenure track. And so navigating publishing and research, and then being head of technical services, we were going through the Alma migration at CUNY at the time, dealing with legacy practices, but also, being pregnant with my second child, and then being, in order to get tenure at CUNY schools, you have to have the second master's degree. So I went back to school for a second graduate degree in anthropology that ended up being ethnomusicology. And then I did a whole thing with heavy metal music and women and how they participate in the New York tri-state area. And then that blew up into like motherhood stories and motherhood and musicians. So there was all these things that were challenging and continue to be challenging. But I think because of those things, I found strategically people to connect with, and like have these stories that resonate with just, life, and how to like pick a career, or how to find the things in library work that work for you, that you like, and the stuff that didn't. And being able to really suss out like, okay, I don't like doing this. Like, I don't like doing cataloging. I used to love it. Now I have a systems librarian that will do original cataloging. I could do copy, but it's just not my thing anymore. And, these challenges also, from talking to so many people, taught me that I was more, my abilities lie in managing people, finding the right people to work with people. And then, I always cite this as like, I feel like I'm a very empathetic person. I'm a big Pisces. It's like my big thing here is astrology. Yeah. And so like, I feel like reading people and, knowing how, again, having done so much different work in different institutions and in, specialties of libraries, like I think that's really honed the way that I can handle challenges. And so when COVID happened, which was another thing because I moved my family from New York to California during COVID. Same thing where it's like, oh, I didn't even know I had the job because I had interviewed for the dean position at CalArts before COVID hit. And then the summer of COVID happened. And I'm like, am I still moving? Is this job still there? They had closed all the libraries. The first thing, you know, is I moved my family to a new state where we had no family. LA is very different from New York City. And so there was, yeah, the same kind of challenges that Emily had with like the refaced opening curbside, you know, services, these kind of things. But again, I feel like as librarians, we're so used to this multiplicity of tasks that we were able to pivot in a way that like other industries can't. And so now the new challenges are working in a startup and dealing with like iterative processes. But at the same time, I kind of feel like I would get bored if I didn't have like stress levels somehow. like there's always got to be like some stress level. If it's not my kids, then it's like work, right? Anyway, sorry, I keep talking too long.
Not at all, not at all. I forgot you worked at Lehman. You worked so many.
I
worked at a lot of
know.
stuff.
I think a good
forgot
sweet
about
spot is
that.
like 4 to 5 years at certain institutions. I really hope this is where I retire, but you know, never say never. So.
All right, Perinda, let's talk about some let's talk about one or two challenges of the study.
For me, challenges would be, moving to this country, being a minority. When I was in my library school, it was a class of 40 students, and I was the only Indian in the program. And when I graduated, when I used to, meet all the fellow librarians, go to conferences, I would see my Asian representation very, very less as compared to mostly white folks in the library industry. So that was a challenge, and that I felt for a few years was a challenge for me to find the right kind of opportunity. I was looking into a library field, but I continued my professional development. I did a lot of networking. I had some good fellow librarians who were had minority representation, and that kept going. And I'm fortunate because I am very happy where I am today. If I look at myself 17 years ago, I think I have progressed really well in my career.
Thank you, Perinda. Genesis.
I guess if we're going to be a little bit more personal, I think one of my biggest challenges has been like keeping imposter syndrome at bay while trying to progress and
imposter syndrome, I could have never guessed.
and
Awesome.
trying to be just open to new projects and possibilities and carving out the space for myself at my job. And just, it's a tendency. I'm self-aware about it now. But I feel like librarians, I think, are the type that tend to breed a bit of or be a bit more critical of ourselves. But like we're all doing great. So we just gotta like stay positive and like be able to trust ourselves and what we're capable of doing. And just keep going.
I might come back to you about the imposter syndrome question because I think all of us might have felt it at some point. Nicole, want to talk about a challenge or two?
Sure.
Or three?
Sure. So there's been a few, and the other panelists have touched on this as well, but definitely the diversity challenge for sure. I've had similar stories to Perinda being like one of the only AAPI representations in my library school, and then graduating, finding that I was often the youngest person in the room and the only minority in the room. So that was a disadvantage on two levels, where people were like, "Who are you? Why are you here? Why are you in this room?" And being a manager and being a little younger and also being a person of color was definitely a challenge, and having to kind of justify why I was there. And this is something I also experienced when I was working in theater, where people are like, "Who are you?" I'm like, "Oh my God," like it's just, yeah, it's been a little bit ridiculous, to have to justify why you're in the room, but definitely that's happened a lot. So.
Yeah, thank you so much for just being so open. We're going to switch to, I think some of you already talked about this. I mean, Joan, certainly you touched upon it, but this profession, We often joke among among my peers that we don't get taught the skills we actually need for this job in library school. I see a lot like the heads on the screen. I see Michelle like, yep, nodding her head. So let's talk about, as those of you are practicing in the field, what are some of the really crucial competencies that you think are essential for library workers like now in a career and those wanting to advance in the career? And the second part of the question is, what skills or competencies you didn't expect to use in your career as a librarian that have proven valuable? You don't have to answer both, but yeah, so let's start with, who I have to start with? I know, Nicole, we just ended with you. Do you mind if I start with you? I'm trying to make sure everyone
Sure.
has first.
Yeah, sure. So I definitely think that the things that I didn't think were going to be applicable but are teamwork and team building. In the theater world, you're often jumping from different shows. You know, you're not really with the same people more than once potentially. Like you have to meet new people all the time. So in order to further your own career and help other people in the profession, you have to be able to talk to people and also be able to meet new people right off the cuff and figure out how the best to communicate with them. So I think that for me in libraries, that's been a that's been a huge thing that I didn't think I was going to take over, but I was like, this is an essential skill. I didn't think that all the things that I learned as a stage manager would be applicable, like how to make clear paperwork for people, like how to email people in a clear, concise manner would be applicable. But that's definitely also something that I think applies across the board.
Definitely. Let me see, I'm trying to jump around. Corinda?
So I personally feel is that being a teacher has helped me. Your organizational skill, the adaptability to work with different age groups, because you're dealing with parents, you're dealing with kids. That has absolutely helped me in my profession, which I never thought. Like today, being a director, also I deal with parents. I sometimes have to deal with little kids who come to the library. So I feel anything you learn in your career, any career, it always stays with you and helps you, even if you change your career or somewhere in your life. And that is true for me. And the only advice for any fellow librarians who are, starting in their career and at some point in the career aspire to be a library director or a manager, I would say, people's management skill, if you can start from a small, like I started with managing 2 pages and then moved up, adaptability to be able to adapt to any situation in library. Come in the morning and, one morning I walk into the library and say the programming librarian is out sick today and you have to do a program. So, being open to that idea about, what, I can do this and I'll do this, and keep yourself up to date at what's happening and the trends, the technology. I think if you have all those skill sets, nothing is unachievable. Like I said, I started with a part-time reference librarian and moved up to be director. And, I can say I'm a living example of that.
Great, thank you. Genesis.
I have 2 things. I think, like Miranda's was saying, adaptability is a biggie. Just in like the last 10 years of being in librarianship, how much has changed, how much tech has like embedded itself in everything that we do, that it's just like the internet goes down, leap's gone, now what do we do? Kind of, let's adapt. And also, emotional intelligence, I think, is a biggie. That's not necessarily a class that we take in library school, but will help you throughout every phase in your life, be it if you're relating to staff, to check yourself, dealing with patrons, especially in the post-COVID world where, I don't know, I feel like we're all, or a lot of people are like more easy to jump to a strong emotion than they used to be. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for talking about EQ. It's so, so important, especially when we deal with, the public. Emily. Oh, you're there. You go.
Okay. So you have to have good good, excellent people skills. And I think a must for working in this industry is that you have to like working with people. Especially if you're gonna, I think a lot of people think that librarianship is like, working in the back. You don't realize until you're working here just how much of a service industry we really are. And I think honestly, one of the skills that has been essential is my experience working in retail from when I was like in my teens and 20s. Those skills are so transferable, and they're almost as important as having my MLIS. I learned to multitask. I can be on my feet all day. I can work under stressful situations and still stay calm. I can work with angry patrons. I can work and I can diffuse tense situations. So I think that anyone who's worked in a service industry, food service, retail, hospitality, all of these skills are directly transferable to working in a library.
Yeah, I have to say some of my favorite hires are those who come right from retail, mostly. So thank you for adding to that. Joan, I'm sure you have a lot to add to this too.
I mean, just to summarize what everybody's been saying already, the points in terms of people skills, you don't really get to level of management without having some kind of people skills. And I think what was a surprise, I guess, just comes from like taking different jobs and working so long in the field, is the conflict and resolution, or this, idea of conflict and repair, and how to really mitigate stress levels of like your coworkers, people above you, managing up, and what that looks like. And then sort of being on the pulse of trends of all kinds. So like what different age groups, what they're reading, but also with technology. I mean, I don't think people need to be a technical expert, but know what's going on in terms of, what's trending and what's being used. And then part two is just, I didn't expect the level of empathy, leading with empathy, and how important that is at the director level, where again, like COVID showed us, this like idea of work-life balance and, work from home, and what that looks like, what it could look like in our industry, and how important it is. When I was working in academic institutions, doing things like having a meditation space in our library, or the pet therapy during finals, and letting people bring their, having dogs at the, the library, and especially, and I think public libraries do this really well. And I think what, academic institutions, museum, and this is what I love about our museum library, I haven't been told no yet, to sort of float these ideas that public libraries are so good at doing, with bringing community, doing social impact. And so that's my hope with the Lucas Museum Library, is that we could take these elements from, what public libraries are already doing, to really be different than your white glove treatment, antiquated idea of what a museum library was like or is like. And, there's some museum libraries already doing it, but my hope is that we're really engaged. And so I think that's something that I didn't really expect to learn or take from the work I did in public libraries, and seeing what you all are doing. Because I see, Jenny, when you post, and I'm like, that's so cool, I want to do that.
Just one of like the millions of, the hundreds of thousands of libraries across the country. And certainly at Hoboken Public Library, we are shameless sharers of ideas, and we also borrow, steal, adapt other ideas. But I want to add to that, Joan, because I was talking with a colleague. I came from a museum many, many years ago, and one of my colleagues introduced me to the who's going to be the next director, I think, the National Museum of Women in a new Smithsonian Institute. And she was saying exactly what you were saying, Joan. She was really interested in the work that we're doing in public libraries, because they want museum spaces, libraries, collections to be really used by the community and to be activated. So thank you, Joan, for, I think it's really exciting what you're building. And I think there's just a lot of
Opportunity
for crossover, and pollination, cross-pollination. That's what I was thinking. Yeah. It's really, really interesting. So we're coming up, it's 12:45. I want to make sure I have time for questions, because we could talk about this for many hours. But are there any questions in the chat, Tara? I haven't been able to check. No? Okay.
Nope, we haven't received anything in the chat, but feel free if you're listening in, if you have any specific questions for the whole panel or for one panel participant, please just go ahead and shoot me a message.
Well, I wanted to provide the opportunity for Joan, because she is calling in West Coast time. We talked about this early on before we jumped on. Can you talk a little about the George Lucas Museum of Art, since it is new? Is it just more than Star Wars, or is it all Star Wars? That's all I want to know.
You want an invitation, right? I would love to host you all. So it's the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art, and so it's about narrative art, which broadly speaking is visual storytelling. And so while there's a component that will have the Star Wars and Indiana Jones stuff, I mean, I think this is why I landed on this job. My second daughter's middle name is Indiana. So I was a fan from the get-go. However, coming from the art world, having worked at the Metropolitan, like this lens of how can we educate folks about what narrative art is, what that means, is really going to be central to the identity of the museum. But it's very, very socially impact forward. And one of the reasons I jumped from CalArts to this library director position was it was one of the, I think it's the first job where at each level there was many women part of the interview panels. And there was a joke at the last panel because I think there was supposed to be 2 men at the interview panel, but it was all women. And our director shook my hand and was like, I know this is the last panel interview, but we do have men working here. And I was like, this is not a problem. This is not a problem. I've never had, I've had all male panels where I've had to interview, or not a very big diversity. And so one of the things that made me really want to take this position was because our leadership, our executive leadership, is very skews more for gender-wise towards women in this company, but also it's George Lucas and Melody Hobson. And I don't know if you all have heard of who Melody Hobson is, but she's also one of the reasons I said yes to taking this job. In her own right, she's the founder of Ariel Investments in New York, I think, and she chairs on the board of Starbucks. I mean, very successful, people to want to look for, work with. But yeah, so we're opening in South LA, and luckily the library sits under learning and engagement, which is usually in typical museums, the education department. And I think we're very fortunate not to fall under sort of curatorial, which still sometimes has a different sense of how to share resources than like libraries and the education wing. And so my peers in learning and engagement are the K through 12 youth and family programmer director, as well as our director academic programming. And so I sit level to these directors, and really at this point, because it was so startup, and when I joined a year ago, we were only like 80 employees, I've really been able to dismantle those. We haven't formed those silos that happen in any institution of public libraries, that we talk about bureaucracy and hierarchy. And as of now, it doesn't feel like that because we're so ground up, but also learning engagement works really closely with our social impact community. So we are often, we're always included the library to table at events, volunteer. Last week we volunteered at like LA Pride in the park. And so these initiatives, I never saw them at museum libraries really happening. Where like the library was included in these social impact forward with programming with K through 12. And I'm hoping to have, the vision of one of our founders was really to have this experience that when a child comes into the library, it's this whimsical imagination gone wild because they got to see a lot of our collection, which will be supporting our inaugural exhibition. So things about like mythologies and sort of how concept art led to the movies that he's made. But yeah, so the museum will include just a lot of stuff that I can't talk about right now. I signed an NDA. However, yes, it's all, if you go to lucasmuseum.org, you'll be able to see the renderings, beautiful aesthetic and architecture from Ma Ye-sang, one of a well-renowned architect. And so it sort of looks like a spaceship. And so I've had to be telling people it's not the Star Wars Museum, although we will have Star Wars affiliated production art and things. And as we get closer, I will be able to disclose more. But it is an exciting time to be able to sort of shape this collection in collaboration with curatorial, and then just think of a library so different. So sort of like, you know, I want to be as public as we could be. But of course, the library is going to have special materials and archives. And so those things will be like sort of by appointment, but we're still, you know, we're still iterating what our policies are and what it could look like if we're not able to circulate materials, and how can we be out in the community, maybe teaching, like having our archivists teach and do oral archiving with the communities and indigenous peoples in the area. I'm learning so much about LA and South LA and the demographics and the pockets of diversity. It's very different than New York City, because New York City is so centralized where you could, I feel like the diversity is like really there, whereas in LA it's spread out in pockets. And so I'm learning about neighborhoods, and our companies able to give neighborhood orientations for all staff. I mean, they're really, really engaged with the staff being part of the community. So I think that's different. I don't know what other, I mean, I don't know how many new museums like even open in like the last 10 years, or like, you know, so, but right now we are privately funded. So like George and Melody have spent over $1 billion right now funding this project. And at some point our status will become nonprofit. I'm not sure. I mean, we're still developing our legal department. So there's a lot going on.
It's an exciting time. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. I hope to do story time, you know, story time in the park and story time in the library. Yeah. So anyway.
Story time with stormtroopers. I'm just saying.
Yeah,
We're more than just stories. It's like saying we're more than just books.
Exactly.
Tara, we do have some questions that came in the chat, right, Tara?
Sure, we do. We actually have one specifically for Joan. Since you just finished speaking, Joan, I'll go to you first. Someone was asking, do you need an additional master's degree to work in special collections?
So that's a great question. I found it twofold. So I actually had an archive certificate for when I went to library school, but then I'm finding archivists, I think it depends on like where you tailor your end goal career. So I found some people get PhDs, right? Like that's always been a thing where like there's PhDs that then transitions to become librarians and they get their MLS. And I think it's usually part of the specialization in an MLS program. So I think I like to hire based on experience. So, you know, if you don't necessarily have an archives degree, but you have a lot of archives work under your belt, you know, I would definitely consider. But I do think in our profession, right, the basis is the MLS in terms of just the professionalizing of our field. Great question.
Thank you. All right, next question. Please share your thoughts on public librarianship in the next 10 plus years. What do you envision libraries to be like? Jenny, if you want to direct that to our panel.
Sure. I'm looking around the Genesis is like, I like she raised an eyebrow. I'll leave this to the panelists. Who wants to jump in and make a prediction? Public libraries in 10 years. Go ahead, Genesis.
I don't know. I feel like we've become, at least public libraries, heavy in like social services kind of support to the community. I feel like that wasn't necessarily as true in like less urban areas, but I feel like as more people are starting to move out of such congested areas, it's going to be more necessary for other libraries. And we're going to be more social service hub, not just literacy and access to books and content. Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else want to jump in on this?
I can just say, you know, from specifically to circulation, most of our circulation at this point, 70% goes through a self-check. And so what I think you're going to start seeing is moving a little bit away. And I'm not saying that this is going to be a reduction in staff, because I still think we're going to need the same level of staffing. We're just going to have to expand everybody's skill set to be a little bit more tailored towards one-on-one services. We're going to have to expand in those ways as well. More ELL classes, more tech help. These are the types of skills that are going to be more and more important as we go forward.
Thanks. Nicole, Perinda?
I feel that in next 10 years, And I would say even in present day, I feel library is more of an information center versus being a place where people come to, get books or see programs. But what I feel is that if you're deciding or if you want to become a librarian, you have to be able to have all the skill sets of managing a program, dealing with the patrons, technology. So back in the day when you went to library school, you had one specific concentration. I want to be an archivist, or I want to work in a public library. But in 10 years, I see is that a librarian has to have all the skill sets of collection development, cataloging, technology, people's management. That's what we are shifting our gears towards, just not having, a specific skill set, but a lot of skill set. Overall, being a librarian is having all these skill sets.
You have to do it
That-
all.
You have to do it
Yeah,
all,
that's-
yes. Wear all the
theme
hats.
the theme keeps coming up of adaptability, right? And meeting people where they
Yes.
are. And it sounds like that's sort of what everyone has been
Mhm.
saying.
Nicole, do you have any predictions, Nicole?
Well, to piggyback on that a little bit, I mean, budget cuts are real, right? So we all sort of have to pivot and learn skills to be like, yeah, your job is essential and we need this. I was going to say this in the next 10 years, probably I would say libraries are going to become more and more community hubs and maybe a little bit less focused on actual books. As people can meet places, there's so many places where you have to pay to go, even coffee shops are like, you have to buy something if you want to just sit here, so I think that for us, it'll be more about the space and sometimes less about the materials.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, right, Tara?
Yep, there's one more in here. Are there professional development opportunities that have helped you, especially when going from one specialization of librarianship to another? So if anyone wants to talk about that.
We'll just open it up.
I would say, oh, sorry, was someone else jumping in?
No, John, go ahead.
I would say professional organization. So like when I was a library student, I joined all of them, right? Because you get the student rates. It's like $10 or something, whereas it becomes so much more when you have the job. But I remember joining like ACRL, which is the academic research and college and libraries, being in the public library associations when I was in New York. Also, your local, so like for New Jersey. I found those helpful because even just staying on the pulse on those listservs, you find out from other folks, whatever opportunities are around, and then you can sort of piecemeal figure out what you like and you don't like in terms of the work. So I found that helpful.
So I just wanted to add in is that being a library director, every year when I do my staff evaluation, I tell them come with 5 professional development opportunities you would like to, embark on the following year, and then how we can make that work. I feel is like how Joan said is joining professional organization, but networking is very essential in this industry. Peers, and being part of committees. We are very fortunate being part of 78 libraries. We are a big consortium and we have so many committees you can try out and see, where you want to be in your career. And that kind of helps you in your professional development.
I think attending conferences has actually been super helpful for me. Because one, going to conferences kind of gets you really excited about being a librarian and all the things that we're doing. But then two, they're usually broken up into different kinds of specialties the tech ones, the like public library ones, the academic ones. So if you're curious about something in a different kind of specialization, there'll be a program about it.
Thanks.
When I was in library school, I definitely tried to look up like different libraries and like different people who had like really cool jobs that I was interested in, and be like, oh yeah, like who's the curator of the theater division at NYPL? Like that's a cool job. Like how do I get that job? And then sort of look and see like maybe what their trajectory was and see what they did. And I like would cold email people sometimes just to be like, hey, I'm in library school, I have questions. And a lot of them would get back to me, just because they want to be helpful. And they're like, yeah, sure, I have time, I'll answer your email. So I think for me, just like trying to figure out like, oh yeah, that's cool. How do you do that?
I just want to jump on again, but what Genesis and Nicole were saying is I love unconventionality. And so I did the same thing because I was like, oh, there's a punk archives, right? There's so there's still not really a heavy metal one. So I would like reach out the same thing and I'd be like, oh, like, how did you find yourself doing punk archives? Or how did you find out, I work with zines now. So I always suggest to folks, what is it that you love to do? Then try to find how libraries work into that, as opposed to finding, just the library work, but like, what is it you like to do that like you find really interesting? And is there a way to publish or go to a conference about it? I always push the Popular Culture Association, PCA, has wonderful panels. And that's like one of the ones where there's a library section in that, where there are folks talking about story times, but also like pop-up books and all these little niches where, you won't realize that you like it until you've been exposed to it. And it's you can connect to folks who are either, just starting out or, in the field already and doing it. So just like Nicole said, like, oh, you can call, and like, we're so nice. The librarians are nice. We always like to hear from folks and, know that the work we're doing is fascinating to someone. So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
I would say that's a great note to end on, because Joan messaged you at 48 hours. I was like, I meant to message you earlier, and immediately Joan's like, yeah, I can do it. I'm jumping on a red eye. I don't need to sleep. So Joan practices what she preaches.
Yeah, who sleeps when you have kids?
That's true.
Who
Right.
sleeps?
Right.
Yeah.
But I think, thank you. First, thanks to everyone for staying on. I thought this was a great panel. Thank you to our panelists on my
Yes,
screen.
great
Thank
job.
you so much, Genesis, Joan, Emily, Perinda, Nicole. Thank you for those joining us and asking the questions. We will share out the recording afterwards. Yeah, I know. I loved it too, right, Ariel? Thank you for your questions. And if the panelists can stay on so we can debrief, but everyone else, have a great rest of the day. And you'll hear from us soon. Bye.
Thank you.
Is everyone okay to stay on for a minute? You want to stop the recording?
Yep, I will in 1 second.